everybody. Welcome to the 2021 International eConference on Religious Trauma. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, one of the great things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Now, something significant to note is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the world's very first and most comprehensive psychiatric research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. And GCRR has actually built a team of approximately 30 psychiatrists, therapists, sociologists, university professors, religion scholars, and PhD candidates from all over the world, all who specialize in the field of trauma research. Now, if you are a specialist and would like to join this international team, just reach out to GCRR through our website and we can give you more information there. But we do have to address one big problem, and that is in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is accepted as a real condition. Unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma remains in its infancy, especially when compared to other studies in mental health. And sadly, this means that there really are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we've all experienced in the tens of thousands, which is that religious trauma exists and that it is a chronic problem within many religions. And as it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical to actually prove it exists. So GCRR is intending to correct this gap of knowledge, and we would like to get your help with this. So we just recently set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first comprehensive empirical study on religious trauma. We want to conduct a massive sociological study on those traumatized by religion in the hopes of providing the foundational data necessary to educate and hopefully prevent religious trauma from occurring in the future. And you may be asking, why are we crowdsourcing this on GoFundMe? The sad fact is that all federal funding for mental health research has come to a screeching halt. And so we have to turn to the public for help right now. So rest assured, any and all donations that you give to this would go exclusively just to funding this study, and any amount that you could give would be extremely helpful. All you have to do is go to gofundme.com and then look for the religious trauma sociological study. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms so we can get the word out about this very important research project. And with that said, I have the distinct privilege of being able to introduce our next presenters. And allow me to share my screen to give them a proper introduction. So we have two presenters for this one. Our first presenter is Dr. Paula Swindle on Twisting of the Sacred, the lived experience of religious abuse. Dr. Swindle is an assistant professor of counseling at Lenoir-Rhyne University in Hickory, North Carolina, and she can correct me if I pronounce that the university's name wrong. Ooh, I got the thumbs up. And she has over 22 years of experience as a clinical mental health counselor and supervisor. She co-hosts the podcast Sacred Intersections, which examines the intersection of mental health, religion, and religious abuse. And of course, is writing a book about religious abuse with Dr. Cashwell, our second presenter. And before I move on, I want to say, if you have not heard this podcast, Sacred Intersections, it genuinely is life-altering. I highly encourage it. You will get so much out of it. So please find it on your local podcast resource and tune in. So our second presenter is Dr. Craig Cashwell, and he is a professor in the Department of School of Psychology and Counselor Education at William & Mary and the American Counseling Association Fellow. Additionally, Craig maintains a part-time private practice focusing on couple counseling, addictions counseling, and spiritual and religious issues. He has over 150 publications, including 5 books, and he's received multiple Research Awards. And he's currently co-authoring a book on religious trauma with Dr. Swindle. And we're very lucky to have them. Thank you both for being here. You guys have the floor.
All right. Thank you so much, Darren. And thank you for the shout out on my podcast. It's always so exciting when someone actually listens. So, so thank you for that. Um, I'm so happy to see all of you joining us tonight. I know I'm on Eastern time, so it's 9 o'clock here. I imagine y'all are spread all over the world, literally. But I know it's been a great weekend, and we're just so glad that you've hung in there with us and that you've decided to join us this evening. So, I am gonna share my screen. You're gonna hear a little bit more of an introduction from me and from Craig. So, in just starting the PowerPoint, I'll have this up here maybe while we're talking so you can, for those of you who are interested in credentials and things like that, that will be there. But we've both been able to attend some sessions so far this weekend and heard many of the great speakers. And so we're a little bit aware of the group that's out there, that some of you are here from a mental health practitioner standpoint or other professional interests. Some of you are here on a more personal level. And so we have found that it's really important when we talk about this topic, and we've talked about this quite a bit, and I'll explain why we talk about it quite a bit, that we share a little bit about ourselves and our interest in this topic. So, to let you know how Craig and I know each other, was got my master's many years ago in what at the time was community counseling, now would be clinical mental health counseling, and worked in the field for, gosh, probably at least 15 years before I decided to go back to get my PhD in order to teach in a counseling program. And during that time, I did youth and family therapy at a nonprofit. I did some private practice. Most of my work as a counselor was in a hospital setting, and about 5 years in behavioral health, where I was working on the inpatient unit and partial day treatment. Spent a lot of time in the emergency department doing assessments and referrals and that kind of thing. And also worked in more medical settings. So interdisciplinary care, designing programs in cardiac rehab, pulmonary rehab, and the cancer center at the hospital where I worked. So I've got a real passion around bringing counseling to settings where you might not normally see it, in less traditional types of settings. And decided to pivot into teaching, into the academic world, and went to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where Craig was a professor at that time before he had moved to William and Mary. And so that was meant, him being there was a big part of the reason why I went to Greensboro. If you've done any research in the field of counseling and spirituality, I'm sure you've probably come across his name. And he was my dissertation chair. So what we're going to talk about tonight is my dissertation study that I did. So this was a few years ago. This was, gosh, 3 or 4 years ago that we did this. So we're going to talk about the study and then how we've seen it evolve a little bit as well since that time. And so when I say we've presented on this, typically we're presenting at more either counselor education conferences where we're talking to counseling professors, or we're talking to counselors in general. And so it's going to be I'm really excited to hear all of your input, because this is one of the first places where people are really familiar with this term and really familiar with this concept. A lot of times we're talking about this in spaces where even now it tends to be a pretty new concept, and people hear, ooh, religious abuse or religious trauma and that kind of thing. So I'm really just curious to see how y'all respond to this in a different way from people who this might be their first introduction to it. But what we found as we present in all these different spaces is that this is a topic that elicits a lot of reactions. People are not neutral on this topic. We have found that people come in, sometimes they're on the end of the continuum where they're highly religious and think that we're going to be bashing religion and that we're going to be anti-religious, and they come in kind of very defensive. I remember one of the first times I was still a doctoral student, the first time I presented on this, and even before I started my introduction, someone started like beating the chair in front of them, and before I could even start, like, religion is not abusive, like just assuming what I was going to say. And then we've had people on the far end of the other continuum who come in really expecting us to be highly anti-religious, and they think they're coming into like, oh, finally somebody understands how bad religion is, and they're going to talk about how bad it is. And then, of course, everywhere in between that. So but we've just found those reactions to be um, just charged in a lot of ways. It makes sense, right? That spirituality and religion are topics that get us riled up in a lot of ways. That's probably why a lot of us are here. So we do want to share a little bit about our background and my interest in the topic and why Craig was willing to take me on as a doctoral student to talk about this. But before I go into my story, Craig, do you want to say anything about the reactions that we've experienced when presenting?
No, I think other than, so first of all, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone, depending on where in the world you are. And no, I don't think so, except that now we know to talk about it a little bit more up front, right? We understand that people are coming from very different places and have different lenses and different viewpoints on these issues. So,
Yeah, exactly. So as I go into my story, I would say that that this picture sums up a lot of why I talk about religious abuse, and we're gonna also get into why I'm using the term religious abuse. I know there's probably been a lot of terms used this weekend, but to share a little bit about my background and why this is important to me, both personally and professionally. This is a picture of the little mountain church where I grew up. I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, and that church is literally right across the street from my house. It's where the church I grew up going to. It's actually a church where my brother, ironically, is the pastor now, which is super weird, but also kind of cool. And I will say, I will just go ahead and disclose, I had a wonderful experience in this little church. And I experienced a loving community. I experienced a loving God. I experienced beautiful community. And of course, knowing now what I know that, of course, I carry great privilege in most of my identities. So it makes sense that I would have positive experiences in a lot of ways. So I just came with this wonderful experience and my own personal faith around that. And as I got into the field in all of those different settings, one of the reasons I shared all the different settings where I've worked as a counselor is because across all of those settings, when I would do an intake, when I would check in with clients, I would hear over and over and over again very different experiences in religion than mine had been. Very different um, experiences with religious leaders, with religious systems, with theology, with all of the different things that they may have encountered in a church or in a church context. And I would hear those experiences and I would feel myself internally a lot of times just wanting to almost defend God, to kind of want to say, oh, but not all churches are like that, or oh, not all pastors are like that, or it's not what Jesus is like, or any number of defensiveness. And of course, being hopefully a self-reflective practitioner to check in about those things that come up, that those buttons that get pushed when clients talk to us, I had to step back and say, okay, what is it? I need to be able to create space for my clients, whatever they're experiencing. And I also need to work through why I'm having this own reaction. And I also realized I had not been really trained with how to deal with this with clients, with how to help people on this specific type of harm or specific type of abuse. I had been taught that it was important to assess for someone's spiritual or religious worldview. I've been taught that it's okay to talk about it if the client brings it up, but I had not been able to to I'd not been trained with what to do when it's more this negative experience rather than a positive coping or a positive form of support. So when I went back to get my PhD, of course, you do a dissertation. I had heard from many people, choose something that you I want to just spend 3 or more years with, because it's going to be your whole life when you do that. And this was the thing that I kept being interested in. This was the things I kept feeling passionate about. And as I talked to professors and took classes through this and started thinking about counseling through this lens, this was the thing I kept getting excited about. So I decided that this was what I wanted to learn more about, started studying the gap in the literature. And as Darren said in one of the sessions I was in last night, I really appreciated Darren's word when he mentioned how when we hear this term religious abuse or religious trauma, we all kind of know what it means. We all at least have an idea, maybe all different ideas, but we all still have a little bit of an idea about what that means. Something comes up for you, but there's just not a lot of empirical stuff out there about it. And that was what I found when I started really digging into the research. There's not a lot of information that's grounded in data, that's grounded in research, and there's not a lot of guidance for counselors out there. So when I started looking for what I could do a dissertation on around the topic of religious abuse, it was wide open. It was wherever you want to go, there's a gap. You can fill in this gap wherever you want to. And so I was having to go to a lot of the theology literature, to a little bit in social work or psychology or sociology, and there just wasn't a lot, period, and specifically wasn't a lot for counselors. So I will step back and talk a little bit, let Craig jump in here with his story about why this was interesting to him, and then I'll talk more about where we decided to go with our study.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. Maybe I would just start by saying I did not grow up in Paula's church or one like it. I grew up in a church, Christian community that I would now define as very conservative, probably fundamentalist. When you're a kid growing up in it, I always like to add, when you're a kid growing up in that, it's just church. And I think for me, I probably would characterize some of my early experiences as bordering on religious abuse, particularly around fear-based and shame-based kinds of messages. But my religious community intersected with another system in my life in this really fascinating way. I grew up in a family where my mother believed, and to the day that she died, until Alzheimer's claimed what was left of her cognitive functioning, if it was spoken from a pulpit, it was true. It was absolutely true and inarguable, and you just took it on blind faith. And my father questioned everything. And there was nothing more fun than sitting in the back seat of the car driving home as a child, listening to my mother and father argue over what had been talked about in church that Sunday. And as a child, it's so interesting. I was listening to Brian McLaren's talk last night, and I was thinking about those developmental stages. As a child, I thought that my mother had the better faith life, right? Because she just didn't question anything. And I've really come to appreciate later two things. One, what a journey my father was on, that he was questioning and wondering and thinking and trying to figure things out on his own. But secondly, what a gift he gave me, because he opened the door for me to question things. And it was pretty young in my spiritual journey, 12, 13, where I started sort of cocking my head. You know, when you call a dog's name and they sort of do this, sort of look like this. And I was sitting in my church communities going, wait, what? That doesn't, how do I reconcile that with this? And that's been part of my journey for my entire life. I now characterize myself as more spiritual than religious, but not anti-religious, not angry at religion, but I also sort of see the light in the dark of it. And that really bled over into my professional life. So I've been a counselor for over 30 years now, a professional counselor, and I'm creeping up on 30 years as an educator. And in all of those roles, so counselor, educator, and supervisor, clinical supervisor, I see very few issues that get botched as badly as this. I've often thought, if I wanted to build a full-time practice, I have a part-time practice because I'm an academic, but if I wanted to build a full-time practice, I think I'd build it around helping people who have been hurt by therapists who did damage because their work was so incompetent and unethical around these issues. And so I really, and that happens in lots of different ways, and we'll get into a little bit of that as we go through the presentation. But I've really grown to be interested in a couple of things in particular. But at the time that Paula showed up on my doorstep with her ideas, I was writing a lot and thinking a lot about a construct of spiritual bypass. And if you haven't heard of that idea, it's that people are avoiding their psychological woundedness and work by bypassing into a spiritual solution. They're over spiritualizing their psychological struggles. And growing up in religious communities, I had seen that, and doing addictions counseling in particular, I saw a lot of really highly religious people that weren't working a program of recovery because they expected to be some miracle was going to happen. They were going to be delivered, that sort of thing. Inevitably, they were not successful cases, right? They did not have successful outcomes out of that, as you would imagine. Watching people who would not allow themselves to grieve, not allow themselves to be angry, not allow themselves to look honestly at their different types of trauma that they had experienced, religious and otherwise. And it was all in the name of what they had been taught in their religion. And it was very unhealthy for them psychologically. So that's where I was when Paula walks into my office and says, I'm kind of interested in studying this. And she said, why I took her on was because she was a brilliant student and a great writer. And this topic fascinated me. And so occasionally the teacher teaches, but this was one of those cases where the teacher was learning, because I've learned a lot from Paula in doing this work together. And of course, which she's taken on in many different ways with the podcast and those sorts of things. So I think I'll stop there. I have a couple of other things jotted down, but I'll work them in a little bit later in our talk. So.
Yeah, I think y'all will continue to hear more about us and how we pop up there. But we've just, as I mentioned, found it important to share that, so you know what bias we might be bringing, and to filter maybe that a little bit, but also to know some of our passion around this as well. So just to kind of step into the presentation. So, I mentioned that there's I was assessing for these types of things in my counseling work. And so just wanted, as I realized we've been talking that we're used to talking to counselors. We're used to talking to either counselors in training or counselor educators, or current counselors, and knowing that not everyone here is maybe coming from that perspective. I still hope that this will be meaningful, but just want to note that that's probably the slant you're going to hear on us. But most mental health organizations, I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor supervisor in North Carolina. Craig also carries that licensure. And, that licensure certainly has ethical codes around assessing for spirituality or religion. Social work does as well. Psychology does as well. Almost all mental health organizations are going to mandate, or at least guide you, that you should be assessing for if your clients are coming from a spiritual worldview. And as I mentioned, there is quite a bit of work that